Rain pattered steadily against the window pane, a rhythmic drumming that seemed to echo through the empty house. There's something about rain that amplifies fear, makes shadows move differently, and every creak of the floorboards feel like footsteps just beyond your vision. Tonight, you're going to hear 10 true disturbing stories, each one whispered in the relentless rain, meant to chill you just enough to keep your eyes wide open. And yet, there's a strange comfort in listening while the storm outside reminds you you're safely inside, at least for now. Our first story begins on a night much like this one, with a young woman named Clara. She had moved into a small, old apartment on the outskirts of a city known for its heavy storms, the kind of place where the streetlights flicker just as a cloudburst begins, leaving everything bathed in a surreal gray glow. Clara was excited, despite the weather, because the apartment was cheap and had a charm she couldn't resist. The previous tenants had left quickly, and the landlord had only vague explanations about strange noises at night. Clara shrugged it off. Old buildings creak, she told herself. The first few nights were uneventful, filled with the comforting sound of rain against the roof. But then she started noticing things. At first, it was small, a shadow moving across the wall, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was standing just out of sight in the corner of her room. Clara's logical mind argued it away. Old buildings are drafty. Old wiring makes shadows. Stress from moving. But deep down, her instincts screamed differently. One particularly rainy night, she awoke to the sound of her bedroom door creaking open slowly. Clara froze under the covers. She was alone, or at least she thought she was. The door stopped, just ajar, and a cold wind swept across the floor. Something brushed against her foot, a faint, wet touch, and she screamed. Her heart pounded as she flung the covers back. But there was nothing there. Nothing, except for the muddy footprints on the wooden floor, leading from the window to her bed. She had locked the window that morning. She never unlocked it. Weeks passed, and Clara became increasingly paranoid. She began setting up cameras, recording every night. When she reviewed the footage, her blood ran cold. A shadow would appear in the corner of her room, never fully visible, always just at the edge of the frame. And then, the thing started moving closer, step by silent step, until it hovered over her while she slept. The camera never captured a face, only the wet footprints that appeared out of nowhere. Finally, Clara moved out, leaving everything behind. The apartment is still empty today, waiting for the next tenant, the next rainy night, the next person to hear the faint tap of wet shoes across the floor. Our second story is about a man named Victor, who lived alone in a remote cabin miles from the nearest town. Victor loved the rain. He always said it was cleansing, that it washed away the loneliness of the forest. One stormy night, he was sitting by the fireplace when he heard scratching at the back door. Animals often wandered close, so he ignored it at first. But then he heard a voice, A child's voice, soft and pleading. "Please, help me." Victor hesitated, glancing at the darkness beyond the glass. The forest was dense, and the rain made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Yet the voice called again, closer this time, desperate. Victor finally opened the door, thinking someone might be lost or hurt. There was nothing. The ground was soaked, the mud swirling in the rain, but no footprints led to the cabin. He shut the door and returned to his chair, convinced he had imagined it. But then the scratching began again, louder, more frantic, and the voice that had sounded so human, was now directly behind him, whispering in his ear, "You shouldn't have opened the door." Victor spun around, but the room was empty. That night, the storm raged as he sat trembling, the scratching never ceasing. By morning, there were deep grooves in the wooden floor, as if someone or something had been clawing from the other side, desperate to get in. Victor never stayed another night. Next, there's the story of two friends, Jenna and Mark, who decided to explore an abandoned hotel notorious for its haunted past. The rain had begun as they approached, washing the streets and turning the surrounding forest into a slick, treacherous path. They laughed nervously, teasing each other about ghosts. But the air was heavy, almost suffocating. Inside, the lobby was a ruin of peeling wallpaper and broken chandeliers. The smell of mildew was overpowering. And then they heard it. Soft, echoing footsteps coming from the upper floor. They called out, expecting to find another urban explorer. But there was no answer. As they climbed the stairs, each step groaning under their weight, the temperature dropped suddenly. Jenna shivered. Mark tried to reassure her, but even he felt the unease pressing against them. On the second floor, they found an old room, the door ajar. Inside was a child's bed, perfectly made, and a small rocking chair that moved back and forth, though no wind could reach it. A soft giggle echoed in the room, high-pitched and chilling. The friends ran down the stairs, past the lobby, and out into the pouring rain. They swore never to return. Yet when they reviewed the photos they had taken inside, there was a face in the rocking chair, a pale, smiling child with eyes that seemed to follow them, even outside the frame. Finally, our fourth story for tonight begins with a commuter named Raul, who took the late-night train home through the city's oldest district. The rain blurred the lights outside, turning the windows into mirrors. On one particular night, the train was almost empty. Raul noticed a man sitting across from him, hooded and silent, staring straight ahead. Something about the man made him uneasy. Every time Raul looked up, the man's head was slightly closer. The train rattled, the rain drumming against the roof. And Raul realized the man's reflection in the window was not matching his movements. Raul's pulse quickened. He turned to look directly at the man, who had disappeared. Panicking, he scanned the empty car, but no one was there. Only the reflection remained, still watching him, still hooded, its movements perfectly timed to Raoul's own. He jumped off at the next station, rain soaking him through, convinced he had imagined it. But every time he rides that line, he notices the reflection again, always just a step behind him, never present in the car itself, waiting patiently for the next stormy night. The rain continued to fall, relentless and cold, as our fifth story begins with a woman named Lila. She had always loved storms, the way the world seemed washed clean. But this night was different. Lila had recently moved into a countryside cottage, far from neighbors, and the heavy rain had trapped her inside. As she prepared a cup of tea, she noticed that the sound of the rain was accompanied by another rhythm, soft, deliberate tapping at her bedroom window. She ignored it at first, assuming it was a branch swaying in the wind. But the tapping persisted, almost in a pattern, like someone was knocking with purpose. Curiosity overcame caution. Leela approached the window and pulled back the curtain. There was nothing outside, just the torrent of rain and the dark outline of trees swaying violently. But as she turned back toward the room, she noticed mud on the windowsill, wet footprints leading away, vanishing into the night. Panic set in. She locked all doors and windows, double-checked the latch, and tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. Yet, the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, now accompanied by faint scratching along the walls, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. Unable to sleep, she set up a small camera aimed at the window. Reviewing the footage the next morning revealed something chilling. A shadowy figure had appeared outside, tall and thin, its head tilting unnaturally, eyes reflecting the faint light of the storm. It had pressed its hand against the glass, left the muddy prints, then vanished before the morning light revealed its presence. Lila moved out immediately, leaving her belongings behind. But even today, she swears she can still hear tapping when it rains, as if the figure has never truly left. Our sixth story revolves around a man named Simon, who worked the night shift at a hospital on the outskirts of the city. Rain poured down in torrents, drumming against the windows of the empty corridors. Simon was used to long, quiet nights, but this one felt different. Patients who were awake swore they saw shadows moving along the hallways, figures that disappeared when approached. Simon laughed it off, attributing it to fatigue and poor lighting. However, he began noticing small anomalies, lights flickering in rooms that were empty, doors opening and closing on their own, and most disturbingly, a patient who should have been discharged weeks ago. Simon went to the room expecting it to be empty. The bed was occupied by a figure wrapped in a blanket, sitting upright. "Hello?" Simon called, approaching cautiously. The figure turned its head slowly, revealing a face distorted by something impossible. Eyes far too large, an expression frozen in terror. Simon stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. When he looked again, the bed was empty, yet the blankets were soaked as though someone had been sweating violently. and a trail of wet footprints led from the room to the elevator shaft, disappearing without explanation. Simon quit that night, unable to return. The hospital staff, he later learned, had reports of similar occurrences during heavy rainstorms for decades. Story 7 takes us to a suburban neighborhood where a young boy named Ethan had a fascination with stormy nights. One evening, as sheets of rain blanketed the streets, Ethan's parents noticed him standing at the window, staring into the darkened yard. "There's someone out there," he said, voice trembling. His father laughed nervously, dismissing it as fear fueled by the weather. But Ethan insisted, pointing to a shadowy figure that crouched near the fence, perfectly still. His mother shivered, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. When they turned on the porch light, the figure was gone, leaving only the wet imprint of bare feet in the muddy grass. The rain intensified that night. Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept returning to the window, reporting new shapes in the yard, always figures that seemed human but moved in ways no one should. His parents began hearing it too. The faint whispers, almost drowned out by the rain, calling from the darkness. It seemed the storm had awakened something that fed off fear and isolation. Weeks later, the family moved, leaving their home to be reclaimed by weather and shadow. Ethan never stopped drawing the figures he saw in the rain, sketches that grew darker and more detailed over time. Now, we move to the 8th story, which involves a young couple, Anna and David, who were driving through a mountain pass during an intense rainstorm. The roads were slick, visibility nearly zero. Suddenly, they saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated briefly by the headlights. David swerved, narrowly avoiding the person, or whatever it was. But when they stopped the car and looked back, the road was empty. There were no footprints, no indication anyone had been there. Only the sound of rain hitting the asphalt. Shaken, they continued driving. But the feeling of being watched persisted. As they reached a sharp curve, the figure reappeared, closer now, standing on the roadside. This time, David hit the brakes, but the figure didn't flinch. Anna rolled down her window, attempting to speak, but no words came out. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, as if observing them, before disappearing in the torrential downpour. They didn't speak of it again. But every time it rained, both Anna and David reported seeing fleeting shadows in their peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when confronted, leaving only a chilling sense of being followed, even in the safety of their home. The 9th story is about a small town library that closed decades ago after a series of mysterious disappearances. During a particularly heavy rainstorm, a student named Grace was passing by and decided to take shelter inside. The building was dilapidated, shelves covered in dust, windows cracked. She wandered through the stacks, enjoying the sound of rain outside. But soon, she noticed whispers, soft and unintelligible, echoing through the hallways. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, forming coherent words that chilled her to the bone. "Don't leave. Stay with us." Grace tried to leave, but the door seemed to resist her. Every exit she approached led her back to the same central hall. The shadows between the stacks seemed to stretch toward her, reaching with invisible hands. She finally found an emergency exit and burst into the rain, soaked to the skin and trembling. When she looked back at the library, the windows glowed faintly, as if lights were on inside, though the building had no electricity. The town eventually demolished it, but locals swear that on stormy nights, whispers still echo, carrying warnings to anyone who dares approach. Finally, our 10th story in this section is about a man named Richard who rented an old boathouse on a lake for a weekend getaway. The rain fell relentlessly, turning the wooden dock slippery. At night, Richard heard knocking on the door. Initially, he assumed it was wildlife, but the knocking continued, rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone were trying to communicate. He looked outside into the blackened lake, but the rain and darkness obscured everything. He opened the door, but the dock was empty, except for a single pair of wet footprints leading toward the edge of the water. Richard never stayed there again. The 11th story begins with a man named Victor, who rented a cabin deep in the forest to escape the chaos of city life. It was a rainy weekend, and the constant patter of water against the roof was meant to soothe him. Yet it had an unsettling rhythm. On the first night, he awoke to the sound of someone whispering his name. He sat up in bed, heart racing, listening intently. The rain masked most sounds, but this voice was unmistakable, soft and deliberate, calling him from the darkness beyond his window. Victor grabbed a flashlight and stepped cautiously outside, the muddy ground squelching beneath his boots. The forest was dense, and rain dripped from the trees, creating a natural curtain that obscured his view. The whispers continued, but there was no one in sight. As he turned back toward the cabin, he noticed footprints in the mud, barefoot, impossibly large, and leading in a loop around the cabin, as though whatever had made them had been watching him, then vanished, only to reappear moments later. The remainder of his stay was filled with fleeting shadows, strange noises, and the ever-present feeling of being observed. Story 12 involves a young woman named Marissa, who stayed in an old Victorian inn during a business trip. The storm outside was fierce, hammering the windows with rain. She had chosen a room on the top floor, and initially, everything seemed normal. Around midnight, the lights flickered, and she heard footsteps pacing outside her door. Assuming it was another guest, she ignored it. But the pacing grew louder, stopping suddenly, followed by scratching at the wood. When she opened the door to investigate, the hallway was empty, yet the air felt thick and heavy, as though someone or something was lingering just beyond her perception. Marissa tried to sleep, but every thunderclap seemed to resonate with a presence in the room. The furniture appeared subtly shifted each time she awoke, and one mirror reflected her room, but not her own reflection. Instead, a shadowy figure crouched behind the bed, its head tilting unnaturally. When she screamed, the figure dissolved into darkness, leaving only the faint scent of damp earth and decay. She checked out immediately, but nightmares of the inn's top floor continued for months, each one accompanied by relentless rainfall and the sensation of being followed. The 13th story centers on a man named Alan, who took a solitary trip to a coastal lighthouse during a torrential downpour. The lighthouse was abandoned, and rain lashed against the windows, blending with the roar of the ocean. Alan explored the base, documenting the peeling paint and rusted metal. As he ascended the spiral staircase, he heard a distant voice calling from above. It was faint at first, then grew louder, echoing unnaturally through the hollow shaft. The voice was crying for help, repeating the same plea over and over. When Alan reached the top, the lens of the lighthouse had been shattered. Yet, the voice persisted, seemingly emanating from the floorboards themselves. He stepped carefully, peering into the darkness, when suddenly the wind shifted, carrying a whisper across the railing. "You shouldn't have come here." Alan froze, the cold rain soaking through his jacket, and he felt a hand brush his shoulder. Spinning around, he found nothing. Later, footage from his camera revealed a shadow, humanoid but distorted, standing behind him for a fleeting second, a figure that wasn't visible in real time. The 14th story follows a teenage boy named Jordan who was walking home during a rainstorm after visiting a friend. He took a shortcut through an abandoned industrial complex. Water pooled along the cracked concrete floors, and rainwater dripped from the broken ceilings. Jordan noticed faint glowing eyes, reflected in puddles, always just ahead, always vanishing when he tried to approach. The shadows moved with purpose, darting between ruined machinery and collapsed walls. He quickened his pace, but the whispers began. A chorus of voices calling out from the darkness, repeating his name in a tone that was both familiar and alien. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the path of the flickering streetlights. It was humanoid, but unnaturally elongated, with limbs that bent the wrong way and eyes that glowed faintly in the rain. Jordan froze, heart pounding. The figure tilted its head, then vanished into the downpour, leaving nothing but wet footprints that vanished into the mist. Jordan ran the rest of the way home, the rain pounding his back like the drums of some ancient warning. That night, he dreamt of those glowing eyes, always following, always waiting, even as the storm faded outside. Our 15th story is perhaps the most unnerving. It involves a small group of friends camping in the wilderness during a rainy weekend. The storm had rolled in unexpectedly, trapping them inside a single, large tent. Initially, they laughed and joked, enjoying the sound of rain and the cozy shelter. But as night deepened, the laughter faded. Strange noises began outside. Footsteps crunching wet leaves, branches snapping, the sound of breathing too close to the tent's fabric. One of them, Sophie, swore she saw a shadow move past the entrance. But when they shone a flashlight outside, nothing was there. Hours later, one of the friends, Mark, went to use the portable toilet a few meters away. The rain was relentless, and the tent flap was nearly invisible in the darkness. Moments after he returned, the others heard a scream. Rushing out, they found no one. Mark had vanished. The only trace was a single muddy footprint near the tent flap and the sound of water splashing in the distance. The remaining friends fled immediately, never to return, haunted forever by the thought that the storm had concealed something hungry and precise, lurking just beyond their perception. The 16th story transports us to an urban environment, where a man named Carl was returning home through narrow alleys during a heavy rainstorm. Streetlights flickered, puddles reflected distorted images, and the constant hum of traffic was drowned by the sound of rain. Carl noticed a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still in the middle of the alley. As he approached, the figure seemed to dissolve, its form stretching unnaturally, almost like a shadow leaking into the wet concrete. The alley grew silent, except for the rain. Yet Carl felt eyes following him, moving with him as he hurried to escape. Suddenly, he felt something brush past his arm, a wet, cold touch that left him shivering. Turning, he saw a face in the alley wall itself, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream, vanishing before he could react. Carl didn't stop running until he reached his apartment, locking every door and window. That night, the sound of rain on the city streets became unbearable, each drop echoing the memory of those inhuman eyes, forever imprinting the terror of a storm that felt alive. The 17th story takes us to a man named Daniel, who lived alone in a small countryside house. One stormy night, rain pounded the roof in irregular patterns, echoing like footsteps. Daniel had been hearing strange noises for weeks, creaks, whispers, soft taps against the walls. But tonight, they were different. The sound of someone walking across the floorboards above him. Despite the attic being locked and empty, made his blood run cold. The noises stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint scratching on the window panes. Daniel's heart thudded as he saw a pale, emaciated face staring in from the darkness, eyes hollow and unblinking. He turned on every light, but the figure had vanished, leaving only wet streaks on the glass and the distant rumble of thunder. Sleep eluded him, the rain now a constant reminder of unseen eyes and persistent footsteps echoing in the walls. The 18th story is about a young woman named Elena who stayed late at a library during a torrential downpour. The rain was relentless, hammering the windows and filling the streets outside with rushing water. She was alone on the top floor when she noticed books shifting on the shelves, as if an unseen hand was moving them. A cold draft swirled around her, carrying whispers she couldn't understand. Then, from the corner of her eye, she glimpsed a figure standing between the stacks. Tall, shadowy, faceless. She blinked, and it was gone. Yet she could feel its presence, tracing her movements. As she hurried to leave, the lights flickered, and she saw countless shadows reflected in the polished floors, all converging silently toward her. The rain outside became a deafening roar, but inside, the library seemed alive, breathing, watching, waiting. The 19th story follows a man named Marcus who traveled to an abandoned hospital during a storm, drawn by curiosity and urban legends. Rain cascaded down the cracked windows, filling the halls with a constant dripping sound. As he explored the dark corridors, he found remnants of patients, wheelchairs, old medical charts, rusted equipment. The air smelled of mildew and decay. Marcus heard faint moaning, echoing as if the building itself were in pain. He turned a corner and saw figures in the distance, patients, nurses, but their movements were jerky, unnatural, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. They disappeared when he blinked, leaving only the rain and the eerie sound of their cries. By the time he escaped, the storm had eased. But the image of those figures lingered in his mind, haunting every rainy night thereafter. The 20th and final story is about a young couple, Sarah and Liam, who were driving through a countryside road in a heavy storm. The rain reduced visibility to nearly zero, and the windshield wipers barely kept up. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the road, a woman in a tattered white dress, standing motionless despite the rain. Liam swerved to avoid her, but the car skidded and stopped in the middle of a flooded field. They were trapped, rain pouring in through a crack in the window, when the woman appeared on the hood of the car, staring at them with empty eyes. The engine died, and they were paralyzed with fear. Hours seemed to pass as the rain continued, yet the figure never moved, always watching. By dawn, when the storm subsided, she was gone, leaving only wet footprints leading into the empty fields and a lingering sense of dread that would never leave them. These stories, each set against relentless rain, share more than just fear. They are bound by atmosphere, isolation, and the uncanny feeling of being watched. The rain amplifies the unknown, distorts reality, and becomes a character in itself. It masks sounds, hides figures, and magnifies shadows, creating the perfect backdrop for terror. Each story reflects a universal truth about fear. It is not always the visible threat that terrifies, but the unseen, the unknown, and the relentless sense that something is just beyond perception. In the quiet moments, when the rain falls outside your window, remember these stories. Listen closely to the rhythm of the storm, the whisper of the wind, the drip of water against your walls. Somewhere within that soundscape, you might sense what the characters did. An unshakable presence, watching, waiting, and always hidden just beyond the light.